from the protoplanetary disk had not dissipated before planetesimals were big enough to interact with the gas? What if a giant impact occurs? What happens to the planet then? What if the composition of the star changes or the oxygen fugacity is wildly different? There are tons of questions one can ask. And unfortunately, when it comes to exoplanets, we don't really have many clues. The one major clue we have is the atmospheric composition of the planet. Atmospheres are complicated, I have been told time and time again. Finding a biosignature is way more complicated than just looking for oxygen or methane or CO2, right? Atmospheres are not just windows into what's occurring into the planet today, but they're also windows into what occurred on the planet in the past and into the interior and the subsurface of that planet. So in order to understand what an atmosphere is really telling us, what clues it has for us, we really need to understand the planet like a geochemist, a geologist, a geophysicist, but also like an astronomer, an astrophysicist, a planetary scientist. And this sort of research really requires crossing disciplinary boundaries. There's really no way around that. I realize I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's really, really important. And this is how AEThER was born. So AEThER is a Sloan-funded grant that we've termed atmospheric, empirical, theoretical, and experimental research. What we realized is that in order to answer some of these questions, we really needed a multidisciplinary group of people that communicated regularly and focused on a common goal. The idea was to try to understand which planets are most likely to host life by conducting experimental, theoretical, and observational research that enable us and the community to tell the difference between a biotic signature and an abiotic signature in the atmosphere of an exoplanet. This is the team of scientists. You'll notice it's quite large. We're a group of scientists that's never really worked all together, but that have very similar scientific goals, but with very different scientific methods. So you'll recognize geochemists, geophysicists, astrophysicists, astronomers, chemists, earth scientists, planetary scientists, observers, experimentalists, theorists, and all the ones in pink are the students and the postdocs, which make up more than half of our team. But AEThER is also bigger than that because we strongly believe that part of our mission is to train the next generation of scientists to be able to speak in multiple disciplines. And in order to do that, we're really trying to build a community that works together and learns together and is a creative and comes up with creative and innovative solutions to complex scientific problems. And in order to do that, we need the most creative and innovative team, and that team needs to be diverse. So AEThER is about creating a community, breaking scientific barriers, and working as a team. So with the overall goal of distinguishing between biotic and abiotic signatures, here are some examples of interdisciplinary projects that we would like to tackle. You'll notice that all of these questions are huge, and there's no way that in a 3-year grant we'll be able to answer them. But we're trying to answer as many as we can from as many different angles as possible. So again, with the overall success, being able to distinguish between probable biotic and abiotic signatures. These are some of the papers that have either been published this year or are close to being published this year. I obviously can't touch on all the research that we're doing. So what I'd like to do for the remainder of the talk is really focus on hydrogen. So this is work that's being done by Kara Brugman, a postdoc here at Carnegie. So why hydrogen? Well, because when we want to discuss habitability, the conversation a lot of the time comes back to volatiles: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. And when, as a planetary scientist or geochemist, we study the interior of planets and we study core formation and the magnetic field, these are also a lot of the same elements that we discuss, right? The light elements. So it's important to understand how these elements partition amongst the different reservoirs of a planet: the atmosphere, the mantle, and the metallic core. And the best volatile to start with is hydrogen, since it's around in very large proportions at the beginning of planetary history. So what happens when a rocky planet is surrounded by a hydrogen-rich atmosphere early in its history? Well, thanks to the heat from accretion and the decay of radiogenic elements like aluminum-26, that surface with the atmosphere is a molten silicate magma, right? A magma ocean. So this is a schematic of rocky planets that are about 1 to 4 Earth radii. The initial condition of a planet here can lead to 2 paths. The first, the most typical planet found so far, the sub-Neptune, with a thick hydrogen atmosphere. The other leads to a more Earth-like planet that might not retain its initial primary atmosphere because of its smaller size, but at some point did have that primary atmosphere. So what happens to the hydrogen that surrounded that planet? Does it dissolve into the magma ocean? Does it partition into the metallic core of a planet? Where does it go and by how much? We're not the first ones to think about this, of course. There have been many studies, experimental, theoretical, that have looked at the solubility of hydrogen in silicates and in metals. The most recent experimental study that gets cited a lot in the exoplanet community is by Hirschman et al. 2012. This plot is from that study. At first glance, it seems like everything you need to know is on this plot, right? Because if you're asking about the solubility of hydrogen in silicate, that's exactly what this plot is showing you. It's showing you the effect of oxygen fugacity, it's showing you the effect of composition, and it's showing you that as you get to more reducing conditions, more hydrogen will dissolve into the silicate, and also that pressure plays a role in this solubility. However, if you read the details in the paper, you realize that they actually did not use peridotite, the composition that we were actually looking for, right, in their experiments. They used a basaltic composition, and based on that, they calculated what the effect would be on peridotite. Now, peridotite is more primitive than basalt. So when you're talking about a magma ocean, you would want the most primitive rock you can get. But you can see that there's a difference between these two compositions. So how did they calculate the peridotite from the basalt? Well, they actually did experiments on not just basalt, they also did experiments on andesite, which is a more silica-rich rock. And they found a difference between the solubility of hydrogen in these two systems. They attributed the greater solubility in the andesite melt compared to the basaltic melt on something called ionic porosity, on the difference in the ionic porosity of these two melts. Ionic porosity is an estimate of the volume of the silicate melt that's not occupied by ions. So there's room for hydrogen, for example, to fit into that melt. The correlation between hydrogen solubility and ionic porosity is that they refer to is based on these two data points, okay? The hydrogen solubility in andesite and the hydrogen solubility in basalt. And then they extrapolate that to other compositions. And when they extrapolate the andesite and the basalt solubility laws to a melt with the ionic porosity of peridotite, they get a solubility of hydrogen in magma oceans that's much less than is observed in basalt. So we wanted to see whether or not that holds experimentally. So Kara has done a bunch of experiments, and this is what the solubility trend should look like with composition, right? As you get to more primitive compositions, you should have less hydrogen solubility if this holds. The problem is that as you get to more primitive compositions, the experiments get harder and harder. And this is why Mark's group didn't do them in the first place. So why do they get harder? They get harder because in order to measure an actual solubility in an experiment, you need to have an experiment with a clean, quenched glass. And this is not very easy to do. So what you see in these pictures from Kara's experiments, on the left is an unsuccessful experiment where when you quench the glass, you get these crystals, right? On the right is a successful experiment with a really beautiful clean glass. Finding that composition is hard as you get to more and more primitive compositions. And as the planet gets larger and larger, the pressure at the atmosphere-magma ocean interface gets higher and higher. So what we really need in order to model the hydrogen solubility from an atmosphere into a silicate magma ocean is we need experiments at a more primitive composition, a higher pressure, a higher temperature, and different oxygen fugacities. That is a super large number of experiments, okay? And so you have to start somewhere. So what Kara has done is she started with two types of experiments. One is at high temperature and room pressure in a laser levitation furnace. And the other is at medium temperature and low pressure in a piston cylinder apparatus. So the first set of experiments are done with what's called a laser levitation furnace. And these were done in Paris at IPGP in James Badrick's lab. And I'm going to show you a video of what these experiments look like. Okay, so here you go. So what we're doing is we're literally levitating a silicate in a gas of hydrogen and argon, and then shooting it with a laser to heat it up. So what you see here is pyrrolite, which is at super high temperatures, that is literally levitating in a hydrogen gas and hydrogen argon gas. And here's the temperature here, right? So when the temperature starts to stabilize, we say the experiment began, and then we run it for a certain amount of time. And you can see that it's spinning within that gas. The benefit of doing the experiments this way is that they quench into a glass, no matter what the composition is, okay? And you can get to very high temperatures. The other set of experiments that Kara has done were done in a piston cylinder apparatus, where you can get to about 1 to 3 gigapascals of pressure. You can see that the experiments here, the composition goes into this inner capsule, and then it gets put into this outer capsule, which then in the outer capsule, she also puts an oxygen fugacity buffer, and then it gets put into this assembly and into a piston cylinder. The sample is quite small, as you can see. Now, if we want to get to higher pressure, the goal really is to get into the multi-anvil apparatus, which can get us to even higher pressures. And Kara has started these experiments as well, but we don't have results from them yet. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so let's get to some results. So these are the data from the Hirschman et al. Study for andesite in triangles and basalt in circles. And what you can see again is that the hydrogen content goes up as the pressure goes up, and that in the basalt, the solubility is lower than it is in the andesite. If we plot Kara's two experiments on here, we see this. So you see the 1 GPa 1400 degrees C experiment is from the piston cylinder, and that was done on a more primitive composition than basalt, but not as primitive as we would like, again, because of the quenching problem. Whereas the laser levitation experiment that I just showed you was done on a pyrolytic glass. That is the most primitive that you would want. And you can see here that data point. So what we see is that the trend, right, is actually pretty close to previous experiments, but not really in the direction of the basalt, right? More kind of in the direction of the andesite. But if we look at the data versus ionic porosity, which is how it had been explained in the past, these data should, the trend should follow, we see that there really is no trend. Okay, I can't, even if I squint, I can't really see a trend here or here, right? There really, it doesn't seem to hold, at least for now, with the current set of experiments. But there are many other factors to consider, right? There's pressure, there's temperature, there's oxygen fugacity. So for now, here's what we have to say about these experiments. Our data do not support ionic porosity as a predictor of hydrogen content. The laser levitation experiments do show high hydrogen solubility in pyrolytic magma. And our data are consistent with the trends in hydrogen content versus pressure. So as the pressure increases, the hydrogen content also does. So of course, we now need to do experiments at higher pressure to see what happens. Importantly, I want to say, I'm not suggesting that the Hirschman data are wrong. They're not, they're right? But for those compositions and those oxygen fugacities and those temperatures and pressures, when we're extrapolating data to different compositions or pressure and temperatures, we just need to be mindful that sometimes the extrapolations don't hold and that other experiments should be done. But as of last week, those were the only experiments that could be used. So in tandem on our group, we also have Ardit Bravenik, who is a postdoc working at the University of Washington with David Catling, who's calculating what the solubility of hydrogen would be in these systems based on speciation and structure calculations. So in the past, like I said, because hydrogen fits into interstices, right? So that's why the ionic porosity was thought to be so important. It was thought that hydrogen that did not change the structure of the melt of, and so what you see here is that when it doesn't change the structure of the melt, they were actually plotting that at higher pressure, that beyond any experiments that have been done, the solubility would actually start to go down, because as you increase the pressure, that space where the hydrogen would sit would get smaller and smaller, and it wouldn't necessarily fit in there anymore. Excuse me. But as you get to more reducing systems, newer experimental data suggests that actually hydrogen does alter the structure itself. And it does so by creating these silicon OH bonds. And so their new calculations suggest that maybe at higher pressure, you would get actually more and more solubility in the hydrogen. So these two, the models and Kara's experiments really work very well together. And hopefully in the next few months, they'll be able to work together and really get at what the hydrogen solubility is in these silicate melts. But the last study I want to walk you through on this same topic is what happens once that hydrogen is in the magma ocean. So let's say that everyone is right and that there's hydrogen solubility that keeps increasing with pressure into a silicate magma ocean. Now that hydrogen is in the magma ocean, now what happens? What happens to the planet? Does it change the evolution of the planet? What could happen? So this is work that I'm doing with Ed Young and Hilke Schlichting at UCLA. And this is a paper that's currently in review. And so what we're doing is we're tracking the hydrogen in a planetary interior. So I mentioned in my introduction that the canonical way of thinking about terrestrial planet formation was that there was no hydrogen around when the Earth formed. There was no disk around when the Earth formed, or the other terrestrial planets in our solar system. But what if that's not true? If we take what we learned from exoplanet studies, right, that there's a lot of hydrogen around when planets form, and we kind of flip the script a little bit and we say, okay, well, what if that happened when the Earth was forming too? What if we look at the Earth as an exoplanet and say that it also had a hydrogen-rich atmosphere? At least the proto or the planetesimals or the embryos that formed the Earth were around when a hydrogen-rich disk was still around. And this work is building on an earlier paper that Hilke and Ed wrote that was published, I think, earlier this year. So let's start with an embryo where the surface temperatures are too high to retain primary atmospheres of hydrogen. Once the embryo cools to below a certain threshold, where the surface temperature for the thermal escape it cools to below the threshold for thermal escape of gas molecules. It's then expected to accrete a gas from the disk, right? Once that gas is optically thick, the cooling occurs only from the top of the atmosphere at the radiative convective boundary, and the surface of the magma ocean can stay really hot. So this gas envelope will actually slow down the cooling of that magma ocean by a factor of 10 to the 6th compared to a body with no atmosphere, okay? So that means that the magma ocean can persist for tens of millions of years. And the threshold mass for accretion of a hydrogen-rich atmosphere, importantly, with the surface temperature above the solidus, right, is about 0.2 Earth masses. Smaller bodies can accrete hydrogen, but there are subsolidus temperatures. So we think that that's probably what happened to Mars, in which case they would not react with the volatiles in the atmosphere. But if you're above 0.2 Earth masses, you should be able to interact with your atmosphere. Now, why would this happen? It would need to happen with rapid growth, probably due to pebble accretion or some sort of radial migration of the growing embryos, okay? So if that's the initial condition for our calculations, right, where the molten embryo accretes and retains this primary atmosphere of hydrogen, we then wanted to see what would happen with the chemical exchange between the atmosphere, the magma ocean, and the metallic core of the planetary embryo, or of the planetary embryo. We used 25 phase components in the magnesium, silicon, iron, hydrogen, oxygen, sodium, carbon, I think that's it, space. And we solved for thermodynamic equilibrium. Okay, that's a huge assumption right there. We solved for thermodynamic equilibrium and mass balance constraints within those three boundaries. What you see on the right in this figure is just some of the chemical equilibrium equations that we use. There are obviously many more. Now, in order to form the Earth, we would need 2 or more of these embryos, right? Not because this is not the fully formed Earth. This is the embryos. Okay, so this figure shows the hydrogen mass fraction for the embryos. You can see pressures at the top up here, And these are the pressures at the base of the atmosphere after equilibration. And this is the best fit for the Earth. And you can see that that would mean that the Earth had a surface pressure of about 0.014 GPa or 140 bar. The overall effect of dissolution of hydrogen from primary atmospheres is the reduction of the metal phase, oxidation of the silicate phase, oxidation of the atmosphere, and a production of a huge amount of water. We are not the first ones to point out that this would produce a huge amount of water. Tim has worked on this, Edwin Kite has worked on this, Laura Schaefer's worked on this, Caroline Doran has worked on this, and others as well. What we find here is that the production of water is linked to incorporation of hydrogen into the metallic core. Okay, that's the key here. So the total water and the light elements in the metallic cores are positively correlated. Water is the byproduct of the redox reaction that drives hydrogen into the metallic core of the planet. And it's also a byproduct of the oxidation of the atmosphere by evaporations of oxides. And again, this has been shown before. This is why we need those solubility measurements so importantly, right? Because in order to know how much hydrogen we're getting into our magma ocean and how much we can then get into the core, et cetera, we really need those solubility measurements. However, as it has been pointed out, even if the building blocks of the Earth were completely dry, this hydrogen-rich atmosphere would generate copious amounts of water. This panel shows the density deficit in metallic cores. It's been known for a long time that the Earth's core has a density deficit relative to pure iron. This is really, really important for the evolution of the planet, for the evolution of all planets. Because when the light elements go into the core, it completely changes the evolution of the planet in terms of its thermal history, its potential to have a magnetic field, and in terms of the density of that core, right? Which many of you who study exoplanets are interested in. So in this study, we let the model run and we found that in the presence of a hydrogen-rich atmosphere, the core of the Earth would have a composition that's about 0.5 weight% hydrogen, 0.8 weight% oxygen, and about 3.5 weight% silicon. That much hydrogen in a planetary core drastically changes its density, okay? So when you're looking at mass radius plots, and you're looking at density, if you have a lot of hydrogen in your core, it's going to change your density of your planet. Okay, so we've been able to explain with just by using Earth as an picturing Earth as an exoplanet, we've been able to explain the core density deficit and the water budget. What about the oxygen fugacity? Well, it's not that the oxygen fugacity changes because of the hydrogen-rich atmosphere, it doesn't. But because of the hydrogen-rich atmosphere, you get a certain composition of your core, your metallic core. And because of that metallic core composition, you're able to oxidize your mantle. And that's specifically because you're putting silicon into your metallic core. And that, again, has been shown previously. The point is not to say that none of these things have been shown previously. The point is to say that for Earth, nobody thought that that just by putting it in a hydrogen-rich atmosphere, right, you could explain all these variables for the Earth. So here's a sequence of events, right? So we have stage 1 is the embryo where surface temperatures are too high to retain primary atmospheres. Stage 2 is the initial condition for the calculations. Stage 3 is the result of the chemical equilibrium. And then stage 4, or Earth, is what we have it today, where we explain water, the FO2, and the density deficit of the core. So all this to say that we should not forget that the Earth is a planet as well. And we know a lot about it, so we can use it for lots of clues. Okay, so I'm coming up towards the end of my 30 minutes. So I'm just going to say really quickly that I've explained why experiments are really important in terms of the solubility. But it's really important for me as an experimentalist to make it clear that a lot of experimental data are really, really scarce for a lot of the models that are currently being run for exoplanets. So I see this one pop up all the time, mass radius diagrams with these density curves. And in order to get these curves, we need lots more experiments, because in order to get these curves, we need data from really, really high pressure experiments, which really don't exist. And in order to get those data, we need to go to government facilities. And I can tell you that at least in the United States, government facilities don't love to give a lot of their time to Earth and planetary science experiments. But when they do, it's super helpful because we're able to get to super high pressures, but they're very expensive and time consuming. But just to say, as an example, really fast, that these are the data for the density of iron, right? Just pure iron, nothing fancy, not NGO, not water, just pure iron. And you can see that these are the data, and then this is the extrapolation. And you can see the error in the extrapolation is quite large. So not to say that you can't use these extrapolations, because again, we don't have the data otherwise, just to say that when you're running models, you should remember that there are these errors associated with the experiments. Okay, I always love to show this plot or this figure because it shows how complicated things are when you're talking about habitability. And I just wanted to remind you all that it's quite complicated and very multidisciplinary. But I'll end with just some thoughts for you to think about that I hope were spurred by this talk. So one is I encourage you all to think about what assumptions or facts you use in your research that might be really interesting to challenge. Suggesting that the Earth formed in a hydrogen-rich atmosphere is challenging a fact on planet formation, right? Is there a certain field of science that you use a lot, but you actually don't interact with scientists in that field very much? I highly recommend you reach out and speak to them because they can tell you where the uncertainties and assumptions are in the data. Are there variables in your models or calculations that are the most important for you to know precisely or the most sensitive? As an experimentalist, I can choose from a million experiments to do, but if you tell me which ones are actually the most key in your models, it would really be the most helpful, right? Because like I said, experiments are difficult and expensive. And so it'd really be great for the modelers and theorists to tell the experimentalists what those variables are. What can we learn from our own planet if we think about it as an exoplanet? And lastly, can you think of a way, excuse me, to diversify your network in any number of dimensions, not only scientifically, but also demographically? So with that, I will end. I went 2 minutes over, I apologize. But thank you for your patience and your time.
Thank you so much, Anat. I'll clap in, for everyone. Thank you so much. That is very exciting, very fascinating. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to do like a more traditional Q&A first. And then maybe toward the end of that Q&A, encourage also more comments rather than questions. So I'll open the stage first. If you have a question, please use the Zoom show hand sign, or put your question into the chat, which I can then read out. So do we have already some questions? There's one. Helen, please.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Anat, for a great talk. I wanted to ask about timescales with your equilibration model. How long would you require to get equilibrium, and what implications would that have for the survival of primary hydrogen-rich atmospheres?
So that's a good question. And hi, Helen, thank you. The idea is that so like I mentioned, right, by having that hydrogen-rich atmosphere, you can keep your magma ocean liquid or molten for tens of millions of years. And that is plenty of time in which to equilibrate. More specific than that, I'm not really sure, honestly. It varies depending on the size, the actual size of the planet, whether it's 0.2 Earth masses or 0.4 Earth masses, et cetera. But within that time scale that you have that tens of millions of years that before it would cool enough to get rid of the atmosphere, you have plenty of time to equilibrate. Assuming you equilibrate, right? This is a huge assumption that I know, Tim, you've written about, this idea of whether or not you would actually have equilibration between the metallic core, the mantle, and the atmosphere. But as a first order, that's what would happen.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Helen.
Okay, there's a question from James Bryson.
Hi, Anat. Thank you for a really nice talk. apologies if I did miss it, but did you mention the technique you're using to measure the amount of hydrogen in your quenched samples?
That's a great question. I did not mention, thank you for asking. So we're using several methods. So one is we're using NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, in order to look at the species, to look at where the hydrogen is and approximately how much is in there. We're using FTIR as well. And lastly, we're using the SIMS. So what we're trying to do is kind of get at all three and make sure that we're getting not only speciation, but also concentration, and that the different techniques give kind of similar answers, right? Because with SIMS, you're just getting this bulk analysis. You have no idea if it's H2 or H2O or whatever. Whereas with FTIR, you can look a little more closely. And then with NMR, you can really get at the speciation quite well.
I think Christine Hauser was next.
Hi, Anat. I was thinking about when you were visiting Japan maybe last time, and we were discussing these issues, and I was asking how much hydrogen you could put in the Earth's core. Not so much because there's evidence that the Earth's core contains too much hydrogen, but for this exoplanet question. You said that you weren't quite sure what the limit would be because there didn't seem to be a coordination issue at those temperatures and pressures. Now that you've investigated it more, what would your answer be now?
I'm so glad you remember that. That's great. So when I was in Japan last, I was pretty anti-hydrogen in the core. And now I have switched completely to the other side, and I'm very pro-hydrogen in the core now. So in these models, in order to fit the density of the Earth, so the density deficit of the Earth's core, we really can't have more than 0.5 weight % hydrogen. But I'll tell you, since Helen's here too, that also fits the iron isotopic composition of the planet pretty well. And that is in our paper as well, but I thought that was a little too much detail for this talk. But it fits. So I think that that's about as maximum as you can get for the Earth. Now for exoplanets, you can stuff as much hydrogen in there as you want, really. I mean, because we have no idea what the density deficit is, but hydrogen loves to go into metallic cores, as has been shown by Japanese groups many times.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christine.
All right, Meng Tian, please.
Okay. Hello, Anna. Thanks for the nice talk. I have a question in terms to perform the equilibrium thermodynamic calculation. Basically, as far as I understand, there will be two pairs of temperature and pressure, one for atmosphere and mantle boundary, one for core and mantle boundary. And for that, I mean, it seems pretty definite for Earth, the PET condition. But what about we extrapolate these two exoplanets? Did you vary your equilibrating PET conditions to see the sensitivity of your results?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did, and the temperature at the surface of the magma ocean and the atmosphere, we went up and down by about like 1,000, 1,500 degrees, and it didn't really change the results that much. The temperature and the pressure at the core mantle boundary is kind of key for knowing also the for the partitioning of all the other elements, right, of all the sitter file elements, et cetera. And so for the Earth, we know that we were able to get that pretty well, to match it pretty well, but the temperature didn't seem to be very sensitive. The results did not seem to be very sensitive to temperature, which was slightly surprising. We also changed the activity models to make sure that that was not super sensitive. And the pressure, we ranged between like 40 and 60 GPa, depending on the size of that embryo. And that seems to fit very well with previous mineral physics experiments as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, the next one, Hannah Sanderson, sorry.
Hi, apologies if I missed this, but did you assume fixed core size and then do your equilibration, or did the formation of the core, was that part of the modeling process?
That's a great question. No, I didn't mention. We assumed a certain core size on a smaller body. Yes. And important. Oh, did you have a follow-up?
I was just going to ask, like, do you expect the core size to be affected by the level amount of hydrogen that's going to dissolve into your magma ocean?
That's a good question. The core size will depend on the original FO2 of the system, and in our model, we started out pretty reduced, right? We started like enstatite chondrite, like reduction. But on top of that, importantly, when you're doing these calculations, your body is smaller, and so you need to account for what happens when these bodies come together and get bigger, because everything will then condense, right? So your density deficit of your embryos can't be 10%, and your core size can't be exactly what it is in those embryos. You have to then kind of account for the way it will be when they merge and form the Earth. And so we also ran a model for the Earth with the conditions we got from the embryos to make sure that it was stable and to make sure that it really still fit okay. And it did. So for example, the planetary embryos core deficit was only 8%, because once you get to the size of the Earth, that becomes 10% based on equation of state data. Does that make sense?
I think that kind of makes sense. I should think about it, but thank you.
All right, Tim Elliott.
Hi, Anat, thanks. I'm a bit overstimulated, so I've got two questions. If we're putting this hydrogen in the core, do we now make homeless some of the other elements we used to like to stick in there? So like silicon in particular.
So as I'm sure you know, I'm a huge fan of silicon in the core. And
how you weigh the two up.
So thankfully, I did not do this. It was not an initial condition of the model, but thankfully, when the model ran, we found that it contained silicon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And silicon actually in very nice percentages relative to some previous papers that we've written. And so the silicon is actually key because it's what oxidizes the mantle, right? So putting the silicon into the core is what then helps to oxidize the mantle. Now, importantly, there was no sulfur in our model. We did not consider sulfur at all. So that's a huge assumption.
So like some of the popular models have a lot of silicon and some sulfur. So in a way, in your model, the hydrogen's taking the mass deficit part of the sulfur.
Probably because we didn't include sulfur in the model, and so we found hydrogen, oxygen, and silicon, and so we also didn't account for carbon in the core. There was carbon in the model, but it didn't go into the core.
Okay, and the other thing, which is probably a mean question, because I know, you know, we assume equilibrium because you can calculate things, but if you have full equilibrium between the core and the mantle, you can really end up with big problems with the sort of model hafnium tungsten age of the Earth's mantle.
I have no answer for that question.
Well, I'll stop there.
I will just say that it's a good starting point, right? We're going to start with full equilibrium and then we'll work out. Yes, that's a totally valid point.
Okay. Anyway, thanks a bunch.
Yeah, great to see you.
Okay, I think we are, one last question, please, Johanna Teske.
I was going to say, I can say this for a discussion. It's more of a comment.
No, please go ahead. Because we want to break out in the breakout session soon. So,
okay. So Anat, can you show the slide where you had the iron, the mass radius plot that had the different iron equations of state?
Yeah.
So I have used this figure myself in talks and really like this study, and I think there should be more like it. So it's not, I don't mean this in a negative way, but the thing that I always wonder when I see a plot like that, which I think that version had some data on it, is basically given typical or even very good precisions on mass and radius for exoplanets, are we even going to be able to distinguish these different models, and we're saying like we really need them. We want to know for sure like what is the accurate composition. And so again, I think that's important, and we should do that. But from me as an observer, I'm like flipping your question, like what is most helpful for constraining the experimental results?
Yeah. No, so I think that's a really, I can't see any of you anymore for a second, but can I click the, okay, sorry, I need to be able to see it. It's a really good point. And I guess my point is that those are the error bars associated with pure iron. And what we really want are the data for like magnesium silicate and what are the errors associated with that. But you're absolutely right that even within the exoplanet data, there's such large error bars that maybe it'll all fall within the noise. I don't know.
That's what I mean. Like, do we need a larger number of lower precision observations or a much smaller number of very high precision observations?
That's a good question.
Okay.
That is great. We end with something to discuss. That is amazing. So I will end